right? It's sunny, everyone's like, nope. All right. All right, well, we'll start. How's everybody? How's everyone doing? We're almost to the end. I was telling this to my class before, my abnormal psych class that I had before. We have 5 classes left, including today and including the final, right? So not a whole lot, which is wild. We're definitely getting down to it. We have chapter 16, 17, and 18 left to go. So we'll look at 16 today and then go to power and sexual coercion and sex for sale. So we have 3 chapters left. We have our final, which is just a 3rd exam on that last day of class. And yeah, we're getting there. It's wild. It's wild to think that we're almost to summer, right? I can't believe it's almost May. Hard to believe. So what we'll look at today, we'll look at varieties of sexual expression. So kind of looking at what is typical and what is not typical in terms of sexual behaviors, which is really tricky to define. We'll look at non-coercive and coercive paraphilias. There are quite a few, so we'll look at some of the more common ones, and then kind of the controversial idea of sexual addiction as well. So kind of what we will look at today. Oops, it's frozen here. So it's really, really tricky to decide what is normal and what is abnormal, right? And that's just kind of goes across the board for everything, right? In abnormal psychology, how do we decide what's a normal behavior versus a disorder? In human sexuality, how do we decide what's like a preference in a normal sexual behavior versus an abnormal one that maybe requires treatment or causes issues? And again, what makes it so hard is what's normal to one person might not be normal to another. And another great example of kind of thinking about that, let's say that you have a partner who really likes to like harm you physically during sex. They like to spank you or like hit you or asphyxiate you in some way, and you like them. That's not a problem, right? If they like to do it and you like it done to you, that's great, right? That's a great match. But let's say you have a partner who really likes to include pain as part of sex and you don't like that, then it becomes a problem. So it's also kind of something that we have to add other people into. If you find somebody who is fine with what you prefer, it's not typically an issue. There are some atypical sexual behaviors that are a problem because they violate somebody's rights, or maybe they're being performed on somebody who is underage and can't give consent. We'll talk a little bit about consent more in the next chapter. But paraphilias is what we tend to use as a term to describe any kind of uncommon sexual expression, right? So it literally means beside love is what paraphilia translates to. So we're looking at things that are considered atypical, right? And we'll talk about some of them. They tend to be divided up into 2 categories, but they're things that aren't expressed by most people, right? And so it might be something that, again, is a problem in a relationship, or it could be something that isn't problematic if both people are into it. So we tend to make one like really key and basic distinction here. And that is there are paraphilias that are non-coercive and paraphilias that are coercive. Non-coercive means that these are things that are typically private acts, or they involve the participation of people who are consensual and adults, right? So there are 2 people who are both interested in it. They both engage in that behavior. It doesn't violate anybody's rights. And it tends to be something like fetishes, which we'll talk about, or like a whole variety of kind of behaviors that aren't necessarily problematic. BDSM would fall into this category, and like sadomasochistic kind of behaviors, as long as both partners are into it. So with non-coercive, these are private acts, things that involve people who are consenting. And those ones aren't so problematic. What is more problematic are the coercive ones. So these are ones where somebody is being harmed or it's being done against your will. Maybe somebody is watching you and you didn't give your consent for them to be watching you or like spying on you or recording you. Somebody flashes you and you didn't want that to happen, right? Somebody is engaging in sexual behavior with a child who is underage and can't give their permission or consent for that to happen. So the ones that are problematic are these, right? And we'll talk about some kind of common non-coercive ones and common coercive ones. But the ones on the bottom are the ones that tend to be more problematic, just because they are violating somebody's rights and they're oftentimes illegal. So if we look at some of the non-coercive paraphilias, by far, the most common non-coercive paraphilia is fetishism. Somebody who has a fetish. And this is qualified as a disorder, so fetishistic disorder, but it doesn't have to necessarily be problematic. Let's say that you have a really strong fetish for, pick something on here, high heels, right? You really like your partner to wear high heels. Your partner doesn't mind wearing high heels. That's not a disorder. That's not a problem. But if you can't achieve like sexual like orgasm or satisfaction or like happiness, unless your partner wears high heels and they don't want to wear high heels, it could cause you some issues and become something that is kind of disordered in a sense. So again, these are tricky, right? There aren't always disorders that we tend to categorize them. So when someone has a fetish, they have urges or fantasies or behaviors typically involving like non-genital body parts. So parts of the body that are different from like, you know, the primary sex characteristics that we've talked about. So it could be a part of the body, like a foot fetish, for example, or it could be an object like women's lingerie, high heels, leather, really common, silk, any kind of rubber, right? Again, so it can kind of traditionally be part of the body or like an inanimate object. And typically these are very common, and it might just be that you fantasize about it, but it could also be that your partner has to have that present, or you have to have that be part of your sex like interaction in order to achieve orgasm. Yeah.
How do you distinct like fetishism when things are like commonly held in like society as sexual when it comes to like for example, you put breasts and it's like how do you distinct what like that line?
Yeah, so the key with these is that you cannot achieve any kind of sexual like gratification without like that item or that part of the body, right? But like you said, like the breasts are a really common like sexual like characteristic, but it could be that like you have to like be heavily involved with like stimulating or interacting with somebody's breasts in order to achieve orgasm. Technically, it would fit the criteria, but that one is less problematic because it's so common, right? So is lingerie. Like very common that people wear lingerie as part of like sexual activity, especially maybe in the beginning of a relationship. And so again, some of them are way less problematic than others. And I would say like those two will be examples of ones that aren't super problematic. These are often like through conditioning, you know, so somebody like learns to become aroused to an object, and they have to have that present in order to be aroused. Yeah.
I guess I have a two-part question.
Sure.
One, is there a difference between a fetish and a fetishistic disorder?
Sure.
And two, is it only considered a disorder if arousal can only be met?
Right.
If fetish is included?
Yeah, and that is the key difference, right? So a lot of people have like preferences. And so I would say some fetishes are just a preference. Like I would like if X could happen, but if it doesn't happen, I'm okay. Not a disorder in that sense, right? So let's say you really like feet. Feet are like a common fetish, like part of the body or object. And so if someone doesn't let you like massage and like stimulate their feet, you can't achieve orgasm, right? So when it interferes with your ability to be sexual, like happy or gratified, that's when it tends to become a disorder versus just a preference that you would like to happen, but it doesn't have to, is more of just like a fetish, if that makes sense. That's kind of the common distinction. Yeah. Oh, is that a hand? Okay.
So, the fetish disorder, would that be more mental or is that physical? Or is it both?
It's both. So like psychological disorders, right, are in essence psychological and mental, but they play a big role in our physical stuff too, right? So if you can't physically become aroused because the mental aspect isn't there, it's kind of both, right? So that's where it gets tricky. Yeah. Yeah. So it's often a lot of like reconditioning. And so they fantasize about it, and that might be enough, or they masturbate to the thought of that, and that's enough. But it's not part of their like sexual like interaction with another person. So there's a lot of things you can do along those lines. And again, they're not always a disorder. And that's kind of outside of this class, but in general, disorders cause significant distress and impairment to you. So they interfere with your life or your happiness or your ability to function, maybe a relationship in this context. So if you strongly prefer that your partner wears like female, like women's underwear, and your male partner doesn't want to do that, that could cause the relationship to have a problem, right? In that case, it starts to become a disorder and run into issues that might need some kind of therapy or treatment to help you either adjust or help the couple adjust, right? And is that the woman's problem or the man's problem? It's like the relationship problem in a sense, right? So it's tricky. These are tricky disorders, and what do we define as normal and okay versus not, right? So this is constantly like changing and evolving. I have a video I want to play for you of this, and it's like one of my least favorite because it's a little like, oh no, it's the one next week that's my least favorite. It's really cringy like to watch. This one's not so bad, but now that I've said that, maybe we'll see if you agree or not. But this woman does a lot of like YouTube videos, and like one of the topics she talked about was fetishes, and I think it's kind of a good description. So I'll play it for you just as another way of kind of, but I think kind of a helpful description, like she was saying on there, it only becomes a disorder or a problem when it's interfering, right? And you can't achieve like excitement or orgasm without that item, right? And a lot of these, again, are completely non-problematic. The key is when it interferes, that it becomes a disorder. So if you have a strong fetish for something and your partner's fine with it, there's no issue, right? It's when you have a discrepancy that it causes a problem. And there's a lot of conditioning that takes place with sex, period, right? Like we talked about primary and secondary erogenous zones like chapters ago. So there are parts of the body that feel naturally good when they're stimulated and touched because they have a lot of dense nerve endings. But people can learn to have other spots of the body conditioned, right? So let's say, for example, that every time you give your partner a back massage, it leads to sex. It could be the moment that like you start massaging their back, they get turned on by it, right? When that used to be something that was neutral, right? So you can very easily condition, sexual responses and items. And that's kind of what's going on here, at least a popular theory of what's going on here. But almost can, yeah.
So you said that men most likely
Yep.
have not.
Oh, it can, but it's way more common in men. Well, like ridiculously so. Like it's like 10 to 1, if not more. It's much more common in men. And I think part of that is stereotypically men are more likely to masturbate, and men's responses to like when they're sexually aroused are sometimes a little more obvious and clear. They follow a much like less variable pattern, if you remember back to what we talked about before. And so a lot of it, it's just so much more common in men than it is in women. But that doesn't mean women can't have fetishes. There are a lot of women who do, but men much more common. One specific one to talk about that's often really confused is transvestic fetishism, right? And this is not the same as somebody who is like identifies as transgender or maybe gender queer or has gone through like a surgery, like a gender reassignment or sex reassignment surgery. This is somebody who is sexually aroused by wearing clothes of the other sex, right? So a man who is aroused when he wears women's underwear, right? Or a woman who becomes aroused when she wears men's underwear, right? And so the key here is you're wearing an item that is traditionally for the opposite sex, which we could like debate forever of what that could be, but that you're getting aroused by it. So it's not cross-dressing for like emotional or physical completeness in any way. It's purely related to sexual arousal from clothing, right? Transvestic means literally to like put on something of the opposite sex. So different from like people who do this as an identity thing, or people who are like drag queens or drag kings, where it's part of like a performance. It is purely related to sexual arousal. So just one that gets confused a lot. They're very different things. Probably one of the most common
non-coercive paraphilias, which has become more and more common thanks to the like 50 Shades books and movies. This was something you couldn't talk about as easily years ago, and now it's kind of like a more common thing to talk about because of those books and movies, which I read for, research. I wanted to make sure I was caught up on everything. I haven't watched the movies, but I read the book. Right? They're what? They're not? Oh, well, I'm not missing out then, right? I think I've seen the first one. Right, yeah, but I've read the books, right? Again, research, for sure, right? My partner's like, why are you reading that? I'm like, for research for my class. Just don't get any idea. So these are probably some of the most common, right? Especially in our culture. We see this a lot. It's gained a lot of popularity and has a lot of misunderstandings with it too. So sadomasochistic behavior kind of breaks into sadism and masochism. That's the S and M in BDSM, right? So BDSM, we're talking about like bondage and discipline, sadism and masochism, a lot of different moving pieces here. But the idea of all this together is like BDSM is dealing with like dominance, sometimes humiliation, sometimes pain, control, but there are a lot of different pieces to this. So sadism refers to somebody like inflicting suffering on another person. So if you're a sadist, you would like to inflict harm, suffering, or humiliation or domination on another person. If you're a masochist, you like to be humiliated, beaten, suffering. You enjoy that happening to you. So again, in a relationship, if you have someone who's a sadist and their partner is a masochist, happy times, no problem, right? But if you really enjoy being humiliated, beaten, bound, gagged, whatever, and your partner is completely turned off by that, that could be something that leads to issues, right? So again, that dynamic that's involved. Bondage is often a really big part of this, right? Tying people up, restricting them in some way. This doesn't always have to be about physical harm. Some people like to be like dominated over, controlled, or even like humiliated or scolded, which can be part of this. Or it can be like harming them like we traditionally see it in the movie. So these have the potential to be really dangerous if people don't have really good agreed upon limits. So people always joke about safe words. It's really common to have a safe word as part of this practice. And it's not no or stop, because oftentimes those will be ignored in here. I used to have this couple that would come in and talk about this and like their practice and their relationship. So cool. And then they moved. I was like, how dare you, right? It was really interesting. But people oftentimes have like a word that means stop, right? And like, you've gone too far. And that's something that people talk about. There's usually a lot of conversation before people engage in this, right? Which is something that I think is often overlooked in the media. Any, yeah, thoughts, questions, right? Okay, yeah, is it about this?
Yeah.
All right. Right, so I'll put that on. My partner will be freaking out on me. Right? I'll put that on. Tonight, what do you want to watch? I have an idea. I love it. That's great though. There's a lot of, this has really like become sort of mainstream because of like those books and because of documentaries and things like that. So it still has a lot of stigma and misunderstanding, but it's something that's much more common than it used to be. Any other like thoughts or questions, comments, anything here? Or no? One big part of this that can be kind of more dangerous than other parts is asphyxiation, right? And sometimes people, as part of like BDSM practices, will like cut off the air of a partner, right? This could be through a gag or a mask. Several of you went to sex shops for your homework assignments. And a few of you, what was somebody who wrote about like a mask? I don't remember who it was, but this oftentimes is something that accompanies BDSM behavior, and it can be dangerous because anytime you're cutting off somebody's oxygen supply, like there are risks that come with that. But doing this to a degree and a controlled amount can sometimes like heighten orgasm for people, which is why it has become so popular. So that is something that is very common with this type of behavior, but obviously carries some risks. A few other really common non-coercive paraphilias, being aroused by being treated like a baby, right? And this is very often men tend to have this one, just like any fetish, more than others. But being like literally put in a diaper and treated like a baby, being arousing. Scatophagia or coprophilia from contact with feces, or urophilia from being urinated on. These are things that, again, if you like to urinate on someone and somebody likes to be urinated on, there's no problem with that. But if you bring this up and your partner has the look that a couple of you just had right now of like, right, and like that could be a problem, right? This is sometimes called water sports. So sometimes if somebody asks you if you like water sports, clarify, right? Or golden showers, but this one's actually relatively common. People enjoying being like urinated on, almost as a form of like defacing them or degrading them. Could be part of BDSM as well, that I literally like urinate on you as a form of like degrading you. Yeah. Yeah.
He died doing self-imposed autoerotic asphyxiation.
Yeah. It could be really dangerous, right? Especially if you're not well, like practiced in it and you don't know what is too far or not far enough. You know, it can be something that could be fatal, right? Or cause damage to someone. If you cut off their oxygen for too long, it could be damaging. So there are tons of these. I mean, there's literally just absolute hundreds and hundreds. She mentioned a few others in her little video, but it's typically stuff that is just kind of outside the norm, right? Like these aren't the most common behaviors, right? And so they can be problematic when there's a discrepancy between people in a relationship. What is much more problematic are the coercive ones. I was so excited about this little like animated GIF that I found up there, right? But the coercive ones are against your will. You do not want this to happen to you. You have not given your consent. And so they're often illegal, right? And they can be very like problematic. People can go to jail for these. You're violating consent. One very common one is exhibitionistic disorder. Like being an exhibitionist means that you expose yourself typically to unsuspecting strangers, right? And again, almost exclusively men, but it's often somebody who's wearing like a trench coat or a robe who will flash you. And what arouses them is your mortified, like disgusted response. So as hard as it is to do, the best reaction that you can have is to not respond, right? Because what often happens is this individual will masturbate later to the thought of your horrified, disgusted response, right? So if you don't respond, then they tend to like, you know, it kind of diffuses it. I was flashed by a guy in San Francisco once, right? I did not want that to happen to me. I was an unwilling participant, right? I was walking to a conference with a group of coworkers and this guy who was dressed as Santa, like just opened his robe, totally naked. And like my colleagues were like mortified. I'm like, just don't respond, keep walking. And like, but they were like yelling at him and totally like disgusted. And oh, that's exactly what, you know, the goal is here is your mortified kind of like shocked response. We have a lot of like exhibitionist tendencies in our culture, but you know, the difference here is this is someone who's unwilling, right? They haven't given their consent for this to happen. Scatolophilia, another common one, making obscene phone calls. I love this. I need a second opinion. Is this an obscene phone call or a patient with a respiratory problem, right? Kind of calling and like saying inappropriate things on the phone or like moaning on the phone or like breathing heavily. And again, it's your mortified, disgusted response that oftentimes is what is arousing for people who do these behaviors. Any comments, stories, or anything here? Anyone else been like flashed unwillingly, or am I the only one in here? Right? No. Right. Again, every time I see someone dressed as Santa now, I'm like, are you really? Right. Not at the mall, like I don't worry there, but on a corner, nervous. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it says like some,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the next one. Right? I got you. It's our next one. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah. And interesting culturally, no one seems to get too upset when it's a woman. But when men do it, it's like illegal and crime, you can be arrested, right? So there's some interesting like cultural norms with that. And that's the reason why it typically is much more so men. People don't tend to be as upset when it's women. Why? Right? It's not as much of a threat. It's kind of culturally normal. But it's interesting how it's viewed very differently for men and women. Voyeurism, similar to exhibitionism, right? But here you are observing somebody without their consent. So exhibitionism, you're like flashing, right? Or like, showing like your body to somebody without them wanting more. Here you're watching somebody without their permission. And again, some of this is kind of like, there's a degree of this in our culture, right? Like you were saying, this tends to be somewhat common. But when you're like looking through windows or like putting cameras places is the way that you're seeing this more and more now. People hiding like small cameras in dressing rooms and bathrooms and places where people are like changing or naked against their will, right? Is very like problematic, right? They haven't given their consent for that. And so some of this is kind of relatively common within relationships and within sexual behaviors. But when it's against somebody's consent, that's where it kind of crosses that line. I don't know, did you want to say more about what you were thinking with that, or?
Like, I know, maybe the word is the wrong word, but I know like there's certain people, like couples who like have sex in public places.
Yeah.
Because I know there's like non-consenting people around.
Right.
Without the consent coercive pedophilia.
Yeah.
Non-coercive because it's between the two partners.
So between the two partners, non-coercive. For the people who are around them, coercive. Right? That's where it gets tricky, right? So if two people like the idea of like having sex in a place where they could get caught, where other people could see or hear or whatever, if they're both okay with that, that's not a problem between them. But would be kind of like along these lines, like you're exposing yourself and doing things like that is technically illegal and indecent exposure and so on, that you could get in trouble for. But that danger of we could get caught and in trouble and be seen is oftentimes what makes it so arousing. So not a problem for the couple, but a problem for the people who are observing it, right? If they get caught. Again, that's where it gets so complicated, right? Between that couple, like, great, not a problem, but it is illegal to do. Other questions or thoughts, comments, anything else here? Yeah.
I get so afraid of staying in.
Yeah.
And just because I always am like so paranoid.
Mhm.
I shouldn't have to, no one should have to do.
No, but it's not a bad idea to do. Things to do to protect yourself, right? There was a movie about that. Oh gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it, where like the guy had cameras everywhere in the Airbnb and like was recording them in the shower. And like, it is a legitimate concern. And then where do you cross the line between being paranoid and obsessive and an issue for you versus just like being safe and protective, right? Because it's not a bad idea to check. You want to make sure you're not being observed, right? And that's frightening. That's not an unrealistic fear, really. Yeah.
My friend's dad is a lawyer.
Okay.
And he had this case, and he usually doesn't do cases like this, but he literally was like, yeah, this is weird. But like, apparently this like store owner or manager put a camera in the bathroom.
Okay.
And in the woman's bathroom. And the employees were like, why is there a camera in there, actually? And he was like, it's for safety reasons. And they're like,
in the bathroom? No. Yeah.
And they sued him.
Yeah.
He didn't get in trouble.
Yeah, you can't do that, right? Like not without somebody's like permission and consent, and and that's not something that would be given. Yeah.
They make the detectors now. It's like you can like scan.
Ooh, okay.
Find like cameras.
Nice.
There's cameras in there,
Mhm.
which I've heard of them before, and I've seen people use them before, like making sure that everything they're safe. But it's an interesting technology that like I think more people should use for if they're going to do Airbnbs. But I'm also more paranoid than other people, so who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know we stayed at an Airbnb up in Big Bear like 5 years ago. And it was one of those where like the person lived underneath the house. Like, so we got the house, but they like lived down below. And she like randomly came up, and like ever since I'm like, I won't ever stay at a place where like somebody lives as part of it. It's kind of it's a cool thing to stay in an Airbnb, but there's a lot of reasons to be a little paranoid. It doesn't hurt to be a little paranoid, right? It can obviously go too far.
Yeah,
There was a recent case actually where a woman was in a changing for a law firm,
yeah.
and she noticed that the mirror was phone. So she basically took her phone like this and put, like, basically they could see that it's like a one-way mirror that other people can look in.
Mm.
So now it's been a thing where people check changing rooms and stuff like
Yeah.
that to make sure it's in one mirror. Because like if you put your camera up against it, you can see if there's no.
Wow, wow, that's disturbing, you know, I mean, and like, it's not, like, this is one of the more common, like, non-coercive means, like, observing and reporting people without their consent. Sadly, it's like a big issue, especially with how easy it is to like hide cameras, and they're so tiny. And like, it's ridiculously simple to do. It's nice to know there's a camera detector, right? That's fun, right? So I can see just like that becoming like an obsession as well. It's hard on both sides of this, protecting yourself, but not going too far. Any other thoughts, comments, anything else with this one? Probably the most serious of the coercive paraphilias, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter where we're talking about consent and different types of like power and sexual coercion. But being a pedophile or pedophilia, pedophilic disorder, this involves like arousal from people who are considered children, right? So it varies from state to state. Typically, we're talking about somebody who's like under the age of 13, right? That's like a good guideline. Traditionally, it could be like a statutory like issue of somebody's like even 15, 16, 17, under 18. But oftentimes we're talking about activities with somebody who's like a prepubescent child, so under 13. And this could be, somebody that you know or somebody that you don't, different terms from like incest to pedophilia, but oftentimes referred to as like a pedophile, a sex offender. And again, it varies from state to state what the rules are. But as a child, you cannot give your consent. Consent is traditionally defined as being an adult, which is traditionally 18. Okay? So if you're engaging in any kind of sexual behavior with a child, it's considered sex offender, pedophilia. And back in the 90s, a law was passed for this called Megan's Law, where it mandates that anyone who's been convicted of like a sexual offense is actually a registered sex offender. And you can go online to the Megan's Law website and see anyone in your area who's a registered sex offender. I don't know if I'd recommend it. It's a little scary to do, but you can. If you went home or even now on your computer, right, you can look up your address and see all the people around you who have been committed or like convicted of any kind of sex offense. I live right by a school, so it's very low in my area, but this could be anything from, being an exhibitionist to a voyeur to urinating in public is considered like indecent exposure and a sex offense. And this is something that follows you for life. Very controversial, but if you were ever convicted of a sex offense, you are registered in this like directory for life. And no matter where you go, you can still find. Did you have I thought your hand was up. Are there any thoughts or questions or comments here? Have any of you ever looked like before? Yeah. How was it scary? Was it like, yeah?
Guy who went viral during COVID because he found advice and child porn was on him.
Yeah, that's a lot. Mm-hmm.
That was an issue during COVID where there were pedophiles in prison, and since there was prison overcrowding, they would let the pedophile out. Brilliant idea. And so, yeah, me and my friends were like, oh, Silvus lives in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And it's hard because you like have a right to know that, right? Like if somebody has violated another person's rights, they've lost their right to privacy is the idea here. And so, yeah, you can go on and find all that. You can click on their profile and find out what, they've been convicted of. And it shows little dots to show you like the frequency or the amount of people around you. It's interesting, but terrifying to look. You had the same.
I live next to two schools, and there's a surprising amount of people who live around me
Yeah.
in next to two schools. I'm like,
Yeah.
I live next to two schools.
Right. And depending on what they've been convicted of, sometimes people aren't even allowed to live within a certain radius of a school
if they've been convicted of pedophilia. Yeah,
I live right next to school. I just did a quick search. It's still.
41.
So literally right next to this.
Yeah, that's, yeah. And again, it might be that maybe this wasn't their offense. Because literally any kind of sexual offense will put you on the Megan's Law website, but that's wild, 41. Right? So sadly, this is like a relatively common thing. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next chapter as well, but this is probably the most, of the coercive paraphilia is one of the more illegal ones because of the age of the person that it's being committed against. A few others that are relatively common: frauderistic disorder, zoophilia, and necrophilia. These are three of the most common coercive paraphilias. Frauderistic disorder is when people rub up against you in a crowded area. Oftentimes, again, almost exclusively men, that will typically pull their penis out of their pants and rub it up against you in a crowded, like, subway car or bus or whatever. It's often like in very crowded places. And again, it's your disgust and like reaction that tends to be arousing, but it's rubbing up against somebody without their consent. Zoophilia, right, with animals, like any kind of sexual contact with animals. It's always the joke. I had to find a little like, like little like sheep over here, right? It's always the joke that it's like, cow or sheep or a lamb or something like that, like with young men. But this is something that is obviously illegal, right? It's one of the more common ones here. And then necrophilia, having intercourse with somebody who is no longer alive. Really like frightening like statistic, but often people who have these coercive paraphilias will seek out work that allows them to be around the objects that they are aroused to, right? So it's really like a very common correlation. Like somebody who is a necrophiliac will work at a mortuary, right? Or somebody who has zoophilia will work somewhere where there are animals. Someone who has a shoe fetish or a foot fetish will work somewhere where they sell shoes, right? It's a very common like occurrence, which is kind of interesting and frightening at the same time. So lots of these, just like with non-coercive ones, there are a ton more, but these are some of the more common ones. Yeah.
Sure.
Some guy like near us, like everybody yelled at him and asked him about this, and he was sleeping. They have his like phone down and listening to taking pictures and then people was like and stuff.
Yeah.
What is that considered?
That would be voyeurism, right? So like recording, people will do that, they put like a little camera on their shoe or something on their shoe so that they can like literally look at people's dresses or skirts or whatnot. Yeah, it would be considered a form of voyeurism. It's against, like viewing them and recording them or looking at them against their will. I'm gonna go behind you and open it to you.
So it was just so much that you can know.
Yeah.
So the parents now, they have to divorce
Mm.
because they were so many cases of like.
Well,
Specifically schoolgirls would just go on someone to get home.
Yeah.
Men would just do it now. So we have a phone in Japan to ask them things.
interesting.
Or it also flashes the thing.
Okay, as a way to like signify. What was that? Weird. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Interesting. I didn't know that. That's
also have that women holding cards.
Yeah. That I knew, but it's interesting about the other. Yeah, it's a common occurrence, frighteningly. Like it's probably one of the most common, and like it's not as intrusive as some of these, but it is intrusive. It's against your rights, right? Against your willingness to have it happen. Did you have a thought too?
I did, yeah. I actually have a story. Well, one time me and my friend, we were just laying on the beach over at Carpinteria, and this probably like he looked probably like 40 years old, but some man is walking around with his phone like in a very like stiff and like specific way, pointing like straight towards us. And then when his back was turned towards us, he moved his camera to like his back side.
Huh.
So, obviously we felt like, and it was like his camera was very pointed towards us. So me and my friend were not okay with that. We didn't know how to like confront this 40-year-old man. He was just like
Right.
walking on the beach.
And stay safe, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. It's staying safe, but I mean, there's a ton of people at Carpinteria Beach. So we knew that if something did happen, that people would, you know, like probably interfere.
Yeah,
So me and my friend actually decided we didn't want that on that guy's phone. So we walked over to him and then we were just like, hey, you know, like, were you recording us? And he literally started screaming in our faces and just telling us like, I have a family, just like gaslighting us, saying like, I have a family, like, no, I'm not recording you. He's cursing at us.
wow,
And then we were just like, okay, look, just to put our mind at ease, can we just quickly see like a flash of your camera roll?
yeah,
And at first he's like, no, that's an invasion of my personal privacy. And then he showed us, and there was like a 7-minute long video of the beach. Who
Yeah.
takes a 7-minute long video of the beach? And of course, like
he was recording the sound of the waves.
he was recording the sound, but it was just ridiculous. So then my friend and I decided that we were gonna like go, we went back like to our beach towel. We saw this guy like walking back like the other way, and in like the same direction of our beach towel was a lifeguard tower. So we were gonna sit by the lifeguard tower as if we had like told a lifeguard about it. And he was looking at exactly where we were laying, like looking at our towels. So we knew that he knew exactly where we were laying. He was looking for us. Where did those girls go? And then when
Wow.
he saw us at the lifeguard tower, you should have seen the look on his face. He was just like, probably just scared shitless.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was a terrible experience. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Wow, yeah, and I mean, good for you for confronting him, like, I'm
It
not
was
sure that I
scary.
would.
It was scary.
Yeah, and then to like, you know, to gaslight you about it and
Oh
scream
my
at you
God,
about
yeah,
it like that.
Like,
Yeah,
so no,
then
like,
don't do
those
it,
girls-
yeah.
And we were both 17 at the time, so we're
Mhm.
just, you know.
Yeah.
Super.
I mean, it's so easy, like, it's so easy, like our phones make it so simple to
Yeah.
record and take pictures and zoom and all the things that, you know, you don't always want done to you. And we live in such a culture of like, everything gets put on, you know, TikTok and YouTube and whatever, like Instagram, it doesn't matter, whatever it is. Everything gets put out there and there's just so much of it, but it's bottom line, if you don't want that done, you know, it shouldn't be done, but it gets complicated. How scary though, too. And to be yelled at is never fun, right?
I mean, that was been.
Yeah.
He's just.
Mhm. And that's by far like the voyeuristic is such a cultural like issue right now. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
In my school, there was this kid, and like we had like a bunch of productions, and so there's like a tech crew,
Sure.
and he was on the tech crew. And he wasn't allowed, I found this out later, but he was not allowed to work the dance tech anymore because he was caught taking videos of girls changing.
You're like, I know what you're talking about.
So, and
Mhm.
he was already like 18, almost 19. And so all of us were like underage, but he was obviously older than us.
Yeah.
And so during tech, like, it was not uncommon for the girls to also be in the boys' like grade room, like,
Sure.
because there are so many boys and like we don't change in front of them, we just go in the bathroom and change.
Mhm.
So my friend heard him in the bathroom, like masturbating, and then he came out with like, and there was a bunch of paper towel in the toilet
Mhm.
and like in the trash can. And then my friend and I went in there later during that same like 2-week period. And we were putting on our tap shoes to do like the routine. And we heard him in the bathroom and his friend was like waiting for him to come out. And it was like very obvious what he was doing. And
Sure.
so we were very disturbed by this.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
he's like, that's gross. We don't want to see that. We don't want to hear that. And so we told the tech teacher and she was like, oh my God.
Mhm.
But after like so many offenses that he's done, he was allowed to graduate. Nothing happened.
Well, yeah, and look, I mean, that's just how many people in here have had like something like this happen. I mean, it's a really common thing, sadly, right? And you can't do those things. Like you can't make other people uncomfortable like that and do that stuff in public. It's a problem, right? And it's illegal, hence where it lies. One more thing here about paraphilia is treating them, right? Again, if both people in a relationship are fine with it. It's not a problem. It doesn't require any kind of treatment. But sometimes people will go to therapy because they have a lot of like feelings around them, or maybe they don't want to have that anymore, or it's causing problems, whatever it might be. And so therapy is a really common thing, right? Like, where did this come from? Let's see if we can identify like the root of it. Sometimes we can do what's called orgasmic reconditioning, where you get somebody to orgasm to something else, right? So you're trying to kind of, in a sense, take away like the power of the arousal from it. And that can be very like common. There are people who specialize in this. Like, you could be a sex therapist who specializes in helping people with like shame aversion, where you like shame them for the reaction, or like satiation therapy, where you masturbate until it loses its power, right? It's like you almost just keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it until it's no longer something that has like a power to it anymore. So there are a lot of like techniques that we can do to try and address this. But again, if both people in a relationship are consenting and fine, it doesn't need to be addressed. But if it's causing legal problems or relationship problems, there are a lot of things you can do to try and like recondition, or look at like, you know, what are the roots of this? Where did this come from? And how can I try and change it? Especially if it's a coercive one that needs to be changed. One other thing in this chapter that sometimes gets talked about, super controversial, right? Sex addiction, right? How much is too much? And this is something that's different to everybody, right? Like, you could interview 100 people, and the likelihood that they all have a different response is high, right? Like, one, like I might say, is once a day too much? And to some of you, it might be. Once a day for others of you might be like, oh, that's nothing, right? Like, no big deal, right? So this is something where people are like insatiable with their sexual needs. Like, they can have sex over and over and over again, and it just doesn't satisfy them, to the point where like it's a problem, right? And maybe they're like cheating on partners because of it, or it's causing problems in relationships because they want sex like 5, 10, 15 times, you know, a week or a day or whatever it might be. And that's way too much for their partner, right? So this is something that's really problematic, because what is considered normal, right? We don't have like a metric for what's normal. And so it's just traditionally someone who it's like they can't be satisfied. No matter what they do, it's not enough. Yeah.
So the person who believes they have it, they're the only one that can say they're a sex addict.
It's really like, it's not even necessarily considered like something in the DSM, because there is no metric of what's normal and not. So it like, the dominating thought is that it's just, you cannot live your life because you have so much sexual like desire and need that it interferes with your ability to have a job or hold a relationship. That it's like, it's dominating your life in a way. And so oftentimes it's looking at like, where is the hole coming from? And like, therapy is a very common treatment. But like, if you have a person who likes to have sex 10 times a day and their partner's fine with it, again, it's not a problem. But if like you can't hold your job because you're so busy like having sex, or like you're losing relationships because of it, that's when we view it as crossing the line. Generally, disorders are considered disorders when they impair your life in some way. It's like, it's a criteria for every disorder that if it causes significant distress or impairment where you can't live your life because of it, then it's usually considered problematic. I have like the best clip of this, but I don't know if I have it on this, like on this drive. Let me look really quickly. I don't think that I do. If you've ever seen the movie Blades of Glory, has anyone ever seen the movie? All right, it's a great scene of this, but I don't think I have it on here. I could go get it, but it's okay. I'm just double checking. So in that movie, for example, like there's a whole like thing of like the sex addicts meeting, and anytime you have group therapy for like, traditionally group therapy isn't done for these things because you're just putting a bunch of people together who have the same struggle, and that can lead to other problems. Like, so with this, for example, if people go to a meeting for sex addiction and they're all there for sex addiction, it can get out of control very quickly. It's kind of like an anger management meeting. Everybody who's there has struggles with managing anger. And so in that movie, they go to like a sex addicts meeting and they're all having sex before and after the meeting in the parking lot. And it's a problem. But this is something that is like super controversial, but there are some people who have like talked about their struggles with it. It is definitely a real thing, but there's no, again, criteria for what's normal versus like out. The last one, any like other thoughts, comments about any of them? Anything else from this chapter? Like anything at all here? Okay, so I think what we'll do, so our next chapter, let me just bring this up really quickly. Our next chapter is chapter 17. I can't believe we're on chapter 17 already. So I think what we'll do is we'll stop here rather than like start 2 or 3 slides with it. But next time what we'll look at are power and sexual coercion. I will say that this is not the easiest chapter, right? Like a lot of people have known someone who has had their power or like consent violated. And so, you know, we'll talk about each one of these different things, but just I know that this isn't the easiest or happiest of subjects. And we'll talk a little bit about like rape, sexual harassment, a little bit more about pedophilia, and then intimate partner violence. So kind of the main forms of power and sexual coercion. As we get kind of here toward the end of the semester, I'd like, just because I have a minute to remind you, start making sure, check Canvas and check your grades. As we get into these next like week or two, just start double checking that everything is accurate. If you have any like mistakes on Canvas, this would be a great time to let me know. There's also that self-care extra credit that's been there all semester if you'd like to do that. Let me put this up really quickly. I have a few, I shared this with my other class, but I am, like, as I mentioned before, writing a book about self-care, and like my goal with this was to have all the pictures and examples be from people that I know and students. So these are the ones that I have left that I don't have pictures of. And even if you don't want to do it for extra credit, if any of you want to like take a good picture of any of these activities and email it to me, I'll put it in my book, right? So I literally have all except these. And so if you do any of these things as a form of self-care and you can find a way to take a cool like original picture of it, email it to me with like a short 2-sentence description of what it is, and I'll include it in my book. So I'll share that with you if you're interested. It's also on Canvas. You can do it for extra credit, but these are the ones that I have left. So if you do any of these things, email me a cool picture of it and I'll put it in. Yeah. I think it's 5 points if I remember correctly, and you can submit it on Canvas or you can just email it to me, but pick one of these because these are the ones that I need still. Okay, so I'll hang out for a few minutes. If you have any questions, we'll have a few extra minutes to yourselves today, and then we'll pick up with 17 when I see you on Monday.
Thank
All right, take care.
Hi.
Hey, what's up?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So I emailed you on Monday,
Okay.
or Sunday, about how I wasn't here,
Okay.
but I still got a 0 on the participation. I was wondering if I could make anything up.
That one, some of them I can like
Yeah.
adapt. That one we did like a class, like
Oh, yeah.
an STI thing where we shook hands and like everyone acquired
Oh.
STIs, which is fun, but like there isn't really a way for me to adapt that one. I'm hoping that we end up with 11. And that what that would mean is your lowest one is drones.
Okay,
So that's my goal.
I can do this.
But do this, that'll make up
Yeah.
5 of those points. And normally, because you emailed me before, if there was any way to adapt it, I would have. But that was a little like tricky. No, I'm glad you asked, but do this, that'll make up those 5
Okay,
points.
thank you.
Mhm.
Hi.
Hey, what's up?
By tough next chapter, like how tough are you talking?
No, I mean, it's like a sensitive topic
I
is all
understand.
I
Are you
mean.
gonna be giving pretty bad examples?
No,
Okay.
not at all. It's gonna stay very like on the surface. And if at any point it's ever like
Yeah,
bothering you,
yeah.
you're always welcome to like step out.
I was just curious.
Yeah, no, like, so if you look like, for example, like if you look at the slides on there, like
Mhm.
everything is really like surface stuff
It's
of
like
like
getting
defining.
Okay.
No, I'm not gonna, no examples and things, just defining
Right.
and like going over them. But it's a hard topic,
Yeah. of
you know,
course.
for a lot of people. So, if it's ever too much at any point, you can always,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, of course.